we have another saying. There's just actually a teacher, Rodney Smith, likes to talk about the subtle aggression of self-improvement. This idea that we're always going to get better and better and, transform ourselves. That's an aggressive act, right? It needs to be balanced with self-acceptance. Yeah, I'll try my best. I'll do my best. I'll put energy if it seems like a good, wise use of time. But at the end of the day, my self-worth isn't contingent on achieving those goals or on improving. Right now, in the full mess that I am, the broken human being that I am, I can fully love and accept myself right now in this moment. Nothing else needed.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Hello, we are calling to inform...
No. Anyone else sick of scam calls? Well, T-Mobile and Sprint have merged, and T-Mobile's network is bigger and better than ever, with scam protection built into its core. Introducing Scam Shield, free from T-Mobile. Get fewer scam calls, period. With Scam Shield, say goodbye to...
Press 1 for free trip to Aruba.
And say hello to answering your phone again. Learn more at T-Mobile.com.
Qualifying service and capable device required for some features.
Today more than ever, it's essential that we're making the right decisions to keep our bodies healthy, to help us be resilient, live better, or simply take on whatever the day may bring. But we're overloaded with nutritional information, leaving us with more questions than answers. Does that even work? Can I trust it? Will that work for me and my goals? How do you know what your body uniquely needs unless you ask it? Well, for the truth seekers, the change makers, and the goal getters, the answers are inside you. Inside Tracker is the ultra-personalized nutrition platform that analyzes your blood and DNA biomarkers along with your lifestyle habits to help you optimize your body and reach your goals. Inside Tracker's patented system will transform your body's data into knowledge, insights, and a customized action plan of science-backed recommendations. Are you ready to take control of your health and wellness journey? Unlock the power of your potential with Inside Tracker. Get 25% off today at insidetracker.com/listen. There's more to explore at HomeDepot.com. From furniture to home decor to bedding, shop online and save 10% with the code UNMISTAKABLE10. Plus, get free delivery on select items $45 or more. Visit HomeDepot.com for more info. Kristin, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, I'm sure happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, it is my pleasure to have you here. So I actually just finished reading your book, Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. And it's a book that your work had been referenced in so many of the hundreds of books that I've read. And you had been on my list for a long time to talk to. And I thought, given everything that's going on in the world right now, this was just really a relevant subject to actually talk about. But before we get into your work, I want to start by asking what I think is a really fitting question given your background. And that is, what social group were you a part of in high school? And how did that influence and shape who you've become and what you've ended up doing with your life?
That's a really interesting question. Okay, so I am a California girl, went to high school in the early 80s when New Wave hit. So I was part of the New Wave group. I had teased hair that stuck up. I wore lots of makeup. And so I wasn't one of the popular girls, but I was in a clique of about 5 girls, and we were kind of the alternative New Wave girls. And so how did that influence my work? I suppose it influenced it in the sense that I've never really considered myself part of the mainstream, and I've always kind of had a slightly, not that New Wave was so radical really, but back in 1980, it was radical. And so I suppose in that way, I've never really considered myself part of the mainstream, doing things the standard way. And perhaps that influenced my willingness to look at self-compassion as a construct in psychology, even though it hadn't been studied before, because I guess I was comfortable being a little bit out of the mainstream.
Yeah. Well, that tendency to go against the grain is an interesting paradox because, as a culture, we reward and we encourage it when it works. But when somebody does it, we discourage it. So, how do you resolve that? Because I think that, creative people in particular, like many of the people listening to the show, have these things that they want to do with their lives. And, they resist that temptation. I know this from having grown up in the Indian culture. It's like this constant battle because, I was just writing about this morning about sort of the fact that I hadn't thought about this in probably a decade, but the fact that my college admissions essay was about culture clash and creativity. And here I am sort of, reliving that again.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, I'm sorry, what's your question then?
Well, I guess, how do you resolve that paradox? Like, I think, because the thing is, like, we're so conditioned by the world around us not to go against the grain, despite the fact that we have this strong desire to.
Right. So I guess that's not a paradox as much as just a block to acting creatively.
Yeah. Or, I mean, not just creatively, but in terms of any pursuit that is out of the ordinary.
Right. Well, I think you have to be able to take risks, and it's true, it's not always rewarded. So in my career, like for instance, I'm still an associate professor and I'm not a full professor, partly because even though I have many, many publications, I didn't do the standard things you're supposed to as an academic, like get big grants and, chair APA, American Psychological Association committees, because I felt it was a waste of my time. So I didn't do it, and so there are consequences to that. But I suppose you just have to have your values and make your choices. My value is to help alleviate suffering, and I only spend my time on doing things that I think are going to be effective toward doing that. So, is it resolving a conflict? I guess for me, it's never really been a conflict because maybe it's because I was a new waver at heart. I never was even tempted to just go the completely traditional route.
Yeah. What role did your parents play in all of that? I mean, did they give you specific advice about making your way in the world or guide you in any way in terms of what might be potential career options or career paths?
No, not really. So, my father wasn't really around. He left when I was 2. And so my mother raised me and my brother alone. And so my mother was a secretary, and we didn't have a lot of money. It's interesting that I'm writing this new book, Fierce Self-Compassion for Women, which we can talk about in a bit. But I was talking in the book about my own relationship with gender. And I think it played a role in that I have a very clear memory being this new wave girl in Westlake High School. And, I was, if it doesn't sound too vain, I was a pretty attractive young girl. And, I was just kind of blossoming and boys were beginning to notice me. And I remember it very clearly. I remember the exact moment I was walking down the halls of my school and I thought, I've got a choice of 2 ways to make it in the world. I can either try to make it by being pretty, and being popular and having people like me and maybe getting a good husband and that whole route that's offered to women. Or I can make my way in the world by being smart. And I chose smart. It was because I was doing very well in my classes. And so I think in a way, I've never left school. I got a full ride scholarship to the University of California, Los Angeles. And then I got accepted into UC Berkeley for graduate school. And then I got a job as an assistant professor at University of Texas at Austin. And so that really never came from the outside. No one ever really encouraged it in me, believe it or not. I think it was just a judgment I had come up with that I didn't want to play by traditional gender roles. And I knew I was smart and this was a gift I had. And this was the path I was going to take in my life. And then it wasn't until later that I was able to integrate, you might say, my quest for knowledge with more of a spiritual dimension, which I really think my work in self-compassion is.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that period in particular, like junior high all the way to high school, when we blossom in any way at all is such a period of deep validation seeking. And, and I know that, part of self-compassion, that you've talked about it is not having that. I mean, particularly with kids, like what have you seen with parents and kids? Like, what would you tell parents who are listening to this about dealing with that moment in their childhood, their children's lives when their children go from becoming these nice, kind kids to horrible human beings because they're teenagers? Because I know I was. Like, I thought my parents were the worst people on the planet for probably about 3 years.
Yeah. Well, so a lot of my work has actually been centered on differentiating self-esteem and self-compassion. And I think what you're talking about is relevant here. So self-compassion is treating yourself kindly, kind of with unconditional acceptance. It doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It also means alleviating suffering. So it means changing behaviors that are causing suffering, either to yourself or others. Whereas self-esteem is about, achieving, doing well, being liked, being popular, being pretty, whatever it is you're basing your values on. And I think sometimes parents can fall into the trap. I mean, either they fall into the trap of pushing their children so hard that they don't realize how they're impacting their child's sense of self-worth. It's very important that we have a sense of self-worth. So they may fall too far into that side of, I can't criticize my child for anything because it'll lower their self-esteem. We've had that problem. Or they're too critical, which creates problems that need to be sorted out with a therapist later on. But I think the thing that self-compassion gives people, if you give people the understanding that they are unconditionally worthy, the bottom line is, even if you fail or you act surly or, whatever you do, the bottom line is I love and accept you as you are, but because I care about you, I'm going to draw boundaries. I'm going to set guidelines. I'm going to have rules. I'm going to have goals for you because I care about you and I want you to achieve. And I think having that stance is kind of the middle ground. I would really recommend that parents think about their child's level of self-compassion. Again, it's not just about acceptance. It's also about well-being, as opposed to, their level of self-esteem, but also considering seriously what you say to your child does affect them. And if you just try to motivate them by tearing them to shreds, that will be counterproductive in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I remember one line in particular struck me in the book. You said that children often internalize a parent's critical voice and carry that with them throughout their lives. Although no parent wants his or her child to suffer, many believe that discipline must be hard hitting in order to work. And, I look back at my conversations with my mother, many of which are incredibly critical and many of which are to still this day critical. It's kind of like, hey, nice to see you as well, Mom. Like we start out with some sort of criticism. And, I wonder when you get to adult life and that, we talked a little bit about therapy, like how do you undo that voice that you've been carrying around in your head from parents' criticism? Because I never realized, like it took me 6 months of therapy to connect the dots between my relationship problems and the challenge I had with my relationship with my mother.
Yeah. Well, so welcome to the club, right? Most of us, a lot of our neuroses are related to challenges we had when we were growing up. Well, the nice thing about self-compassion, one of the reasons I'm such a strong believer in it is, in many ways, it's a way of reparenting yourself. Right. So we have these voices in our head, and these voices in our head, they come from our parents, but not just our parents. They come from, the kids who bullied you in middle school, or the culture that tells you need to look a certain way to be, good enough. So there are all these external voices in our head that we internalize, many of which are not healthy. And so what we're doing with self-compassion is we're paying conscious attention to how we relate to ourselves. Instead of it just being kind of the default mode that we learn without thinking about it, we actually think, well, how do I relate to myself? Is this the way I want to be relating to myself? Am I meeting my needs? And once we make that whole process conscious, and, if we need something, we try to meet that need. If we're feeling badly, we try to comfort ourselves. If we need to, motivate a change, we do that out of care as opposed to criticism. Once we make that change, we actually can change our attachment patterns. There's research showing that one of the things you can do with self-compassion as an adult is give yourself what they call adult earned secure attachment, which means that you feel worthy and you trust that your needs will be met. Not from your parents. Maybe they didn't meet your needs. But once you can meet your needs yourself, then you can learn to trust that. So it's really a way of in many ways, reprogramming the messages we are given when we were young, and being conscious about the messages we want to give ourselves.
It's funny you mentioned the word reprogramming, because I was thinking about this in terms of sort of the 3 layers of programming that we get, right? Parents, peers, and society. And of course, our education system. Now, you being an educator, growing up in Indian culture, the thing that is made very clear from the start is that education is a priority and you are not to come home with anything less than an A. Like when we would hear about our friends who got their report cards put on fridges, and our parents like, yeah, great, you get a roof over your head and a meal every night. That's just the expectation. But it seems like there's also a downside to this. And you're an educator at, arguably a very prestigious school, and I was a UC Berkeley undergrad, so I know the kind of pressure that goes into places like that. My sister and I say, like, there's no way in hell we would get into these schools now. And I wonder, as an educator, what you've seen as the impact of a lack of self-compassion, and what is the role that self-compassion is going to play in needs to play in education.
Yeah, I mean, so it is a shame. So, for instance, that the students who come to me complaining about their grade are the ones who got the A minus, and not, the perfectionists. And I think it does create a tremendous amount of pressure. Now, having said that, there is some reality check in that. I agree. I would never have gotten my tenure position at UT Austin, nowadays, because the stakes keep going up and up. And so, there is the reality of what the type of grades or what you need to get the type of job you want. And that has to be dealt with. And that's why we can, motivate ourselves out of kindness, because we want to achieve our goals, because we care. At the other side of it, it says nothing about our self-worth. I think that's really so important that, yes, we want to get, maybe you want your kids to get A's because you want them to be able to get into a good college because you care about them. But if they don't, it doesn't mean they're any less worthy or that you love them any less. And so kind of distinguishing the fact of whether or not you're a worthy, valuable human being and you're lovable from, are you able to achieve your goals? And what we know from the research, really unequivocally, is that kindness and caring is a better motivator. It helps you achieve your goals more than shame and self-criticism or criticism of others, right? So the goals are still the same either way. It's a shame that we have to get straight A's, but if we do, so be it. That's the way the world is. But how are you going to reach your goals? You're going to have a better fighting chance motivating yourself or your kids with kindness than you are with criticism. Actually, shame and criticism undermines these goals often. I mean, what they can do is they can light a fire underneath someone and get them to really pay attention and work hard. But you can also light a fire under someone and get them to pay attention and work hard with care and kindness as well. It's actually more effective, because criticism, it creates all these counterproductive things like fear of failure, performance anxiety, right? Which actually, the tendency to want to procrastinate, all these things really undermine your ability to achieve your goals.
This is a weird question, but obviously grades play a role in education. If you were to restructure this from a standpoint of, okay, how do we infuse the ability to have self-compassion? Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned to you, in the culture I grew up in, it was the pressure to get good grades was so intense. And this also makes me wonder, as I was saying, before we hit record here, I was recently on this Netflix documentary about Indian matchmaking, which my roommates made me wake up at 1 a.m. to watch because it just dropped on Netflix at midnight. And going back to it, what struck me as I was watching some of the other episodes, it was watching the matchmaker and how so often everything was about looking at a list of accomplishments on a resume, basically what David Brooks would call resume values as opposed to eulogy values. It was like accomplishment mattered more than character. And so what that made me wonder was, when you look at self-compassion research, how have you seen this differ across cultures?
Right. Well, so, there's not a ton of cross-cultural research. There is some, which certainly shows that levels of self-compassion vary by culture, right? Some cultures encourage it more than others. For instance, a place like Thailand, they have pretty high levels of self-compassion because Buddhism is in, kind of part of the culture. People go on retreat, they meditate, they take it very seriously. Other cultures like China, it's not just an East-West thing. China has very low levels of self-compassion because they encourage self-criticism so much. The UK, I don't think there's been much self-compassion research in India, interestingly, so I don't know a lot about it. So yeah, culture influences how much self-compassion people have. Although there does seem to be a universal beneficial effect to self-compassion, in the sense that taking the stance toward oneself, at least from what we know so far. I mean, there's not a lot of research, so I don't want to be too hard and fast about it. But it seems that even in places with low level, where self-compassion isn't the norm, those individuals in those cultures who have more self-compassion have better mental health, for instance. They're less depressed, they're happier with their lives, they're more satisfied. So it does seem to be to tap into something universal, and I think it makes sense because compassion and love, these are universal values, right? And I think what's so sad about what you're describing is when people place all their values in just your resume and your accomplishments, it leaves out the most important things, like, how connected are you? How much love do you have in your life? How kind are you? How much do you help other people? And that is a shame because, we've got people running the world with a lot of resume accomplishments, and our world is dying because of global warming. So what did that buy us?
Yeah.
So.
Hello, we are calling to inform.
No. Anyone else sick of scam calls? Well, T-Mobile and Sprint have merged, and T-Mobile's network is bigger and better than ever, with scam protection built into its core. Introducing Scam Shield, free from T-Mobile. Get fewer scam calls, period. With Scam Shield, say goodbye to
Press 1 for free trip to Aruba.
and say hello to answering your phone again. Learn more at T-Mobile.com.
Qualifying service and capable device required for some features.
With the Home Depot, decorating your home is now easier than ever before. Start by heading to HomeDepot.com, where you can shop for everything for every room. Browse thousands of furniture pieces and decorative accents to fit any style. Explore bedding and bath linens, kitchenware, and small appliances, all at the right prices. Whether you're going for a brand new look or a seasonal refresh, or simply a few finishing touches, the Home Depot has all of the pieces you need. And the best part? Shop today and you'll get free and flexible delivery with easy returns. Plus, for a limited time, you can save even more on the styles you love when you use the code unmistakable10 at checkout. Find exactly what you're looking for and more at homedepot.com/decor. Valid on select items online only. Free delivery on select items $45 or more. Visit homedepot.com for more information. So COVID-19 has made all of our lives super complicated. It's changed so much from the way that we live to the way that we work. And there's so much information coming at us every day between news briefings and online articles. And if you have a family like mine full of doctors, even family Zoom chats. So figuring out what you're actually supposed to do in the workplace can be really overwhelming. Well, if you want to get safely back to work during COVID-19, there's an app for that. iAuditor by Safety Culture will help keep your coworkers and customers safe. It's a simple safety checklist and inspection app that anyone can learn within minutes. It allows you to do things like follow CDC guidelines, complete COVID-19 safety inspections, maintain an audit trail, and stay safe. There are hundreds of preloaded checklists available to download for free. iAuditor is the world's largest safety checklist app with more than 600 million checks completed per year. Visit safetyculture.com for your free checklist today. Again, visit safetyculture.com to download your free checklist today.
Yeah, so that, it's interesting. So I think for me, the next layer of sort of our programming is, so you've got, parents, we've got education and peer groups. Like peer groups is one of those is really fascinating ones to me, which is why I started with the social group question, because I wasn't popular in high school. I was definitely far from cool, and it was one of those things where like, I think that made me feel that it's like, oh, having a girlfriend in high school is just not, like, it was like, oh, that's never going to happen. It's just not realistic. It's not like I didn't like girls in high school, but, and yet, like I said, it goes back to that period of sort of validation seeking. So what role does self-compassion play during that period? And like, how do our peer groups affect our own self-compassion?
Yeah. And so again, peer groups really impact our level of self-esteem. In fact, peer approval is one of the most important sources of self-esteem. And by the way, it's not how much your good friends like you, it's how much like other kids in school or other people at work, people who don't know you very well, and you actually don't really know very well their opinions of you. It's a very kind of lousy source of information. We put a lot of our self-esteem, we base a lot of our self-esteem on what other people think of us. So self-compassion really, it doesn't come from peer approval. I mean, so you might say that if you have very critical peers and very critical parents, you might be low in self-compassion. But the way we get self-compassion isn't from external sources. Self-compassion is an inside job, right? So yeah, if we have supportive parents and friends, it's going to make it more fertile ground for us to have self-compassion, to accept ourselves as we are, to be kind to ourselves, to be supportive to ourselves. But it's really not contingent on outside forces, right? And that's one of its amazing strengths, is the fact that it's not contingent on success. It's not contingent on other people liking us. It comes from connecting to the larger whole that's even bigger than any one particular group of people, and just really understanding that as a conscious human being who lives, who breathes, who suffers, I'm intrinsically worthy of care and support. And so it's a much more stable source of self-worth. It doesn't fluctuate nearly as much. And even when you're really in bad conditions, you can still, and I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's theoretically possible, and actually it happens if you've experienced at it. Even in bad conditions, you can still give yourself unconditional love and support and kindness, regardless of how other people are treating you. And it really frees you from being so dependent on the opinions of others.
So I think the other sort of the what I call the fifth layer, because this whole conversation is giving me an idea of a blog post for about the 5 layers of our social programming. The other one finally being culture, and culture is so broad, not just culture in terms of ethnicity or that, but like the media we consume, the movies we watch. I mean, particularly today with the prevalence of social media in our lives, what are the negatives and positives of this? Can you control the culture around you and the things that you consume in order to influence your self-compassion? Because I feel like if you look at social media, it's pretty easy to suddenly feel a complete lack of self-compassion most days. Like as an author, I can tell you when I see another author friend, it's like, oh, their book hit the New York Times bestseller list. God, I suck at this. Like that sort of self-criticism kicks in. But yeah, I wonder. And then not only that, like if you look at the message of popular culture, right? You look at TV shows like Entourage, where the sort of standard is, oh, this guy is famous, he's rich. Heather Havrilesky wrote about this in one of her books, where she wrote an essay about sort of what, like, that there's no better version of you waiting in the future, but yet to me that's like so prevalent and embedded into every aspect of all our messaging and pop culture. I mean, even something like this podcast, right? We expose people to models of possibility, people who are where they're not. And I've had people who literally emailed me and said, I can't listen to this anymore because these people are so amazing. It makes me feel worse about my own life. And I said, I understand. I can relate to that.
Yeah. So, we have a saying in the self-compassion world and self-compassion training, which is the goal of practice is simply to become a self-compassionate mess. Just a compassionate mess. That's your only goal. That actually becomes your goal. And that's an achievable goal, right? Not being a mess is actually not an achievable goal, because we're all human beings. Controlling our culture is not an achievable goal. Yeah, I mean, it's probably wise to, try to be careful of what you consume in terms of media. And if you care about yourself, you aren't going to consume things that are really causing you pain. But really, the ultimate goal is just to be compassionate in how you relate to your pain. And that can be done at any moment. And what happens is when you start valuing the compassion more than the achievements, or more than, what people think of you, or more than, getting it right, then you have that resource to kind of draw from it in any moment. And really what that resource is love. So there are 3 components of self-compassion. One is the kindness that we've been talking about, just like love. But there's also mindfulness, the ability to be aware of what's happening, so we aren't so lost in what's happening. Mindfulness is incredibly important when dealing with other people's reactions and dealing with the media, so that we kind of rise above it. We're kind of aware of, oh yeah, this is the media giving us these messages, but I don't have to believe that. And then the third component is common humanity, just recognizing that we're all in this together. We're all part of this larger interdependent whole. It's the idea that we're all separate selves, that are uninfluenced by the people, is a complete lie. It's an illusion, right? We are all part of a larger interdependent whole, and not just people. I mean, the planet, right? All conscious beings. And some people even argue, well, everything. If you really break it down, we're all just kind of quarks flashing in and out of existence, right? And so when you take that larger view of interdependence and you combine it with mindful awareness of what's arising, so we aren't held captive by our thoughts, and then you bring love and kindness into the mix, then you really have all you need. It's loving, connected presence, and that's where we draw our sense of happiness. That's where we draw our sense of self-worth. It's something that goes with us wherever we go, no matter how we're faring that day, good or bad. can accompany us through death. It can accompany us, through aging and losing our looks and all the vicissitudes of life, and if that becomes your goal to cultivate loving, connected presence, regardless of circumstances, that's enough. It doesn't mean you don't pay attention to the other stuff because, again, you care about yourself and you don't want you to suffer. But it's a much better place to invest our energy and time than getting things right.
Well, I think that what's interesting to me is that the work that has been done by the world of self-development, by many of the guests here on the show who do amazing work that has made profound changes in numerous people's lives, also on the counter narrative has this other narrative of there's this gap between who you are and where you want to be, and that gap just feels eternal because of this. And so what it makes me wonder is and this is a question that's been on my mind for a while, as having finished 2 books and talking to my friend Ryan Holiday about this sort of illusion of the next level, is that can you have the coexistence of both fulfillment and ambition?
Yes, I think you can. So I like to talk about the yin and the yang of self-compassion. So the yin of self-compassion, that is the self-acceptance. That's the loving, connected presence. That's when we can just be with ourselves as we are. That's when we're the compassionate mass. That's it's kind of a more just receptive way of being in the world. But there's also the yang of self-compassion, and that's when we take action to achieve our goals. Sometimes we need to take action to protect ourselves. Like if you're, I don't know about your mother, but maybe if you have a mother that's too controlling, maybe you need to draw some boundaries to be happy. Maybe you say, I'm sorry, mother, that's not okay for you to talk to me that way, right? To the extent that you can, drawing boundaries, protecting yourself, that also helps with, sexism, racism, all those sorts of boundary violations. Then we also have to meet our needs, right? So really asking ourselves, well, what do I need? And so one of the problems is sometimes what we think we need isn't what we really need. We may think we need money and status and fame. That may not at all be what we really need. That may not actually make us happy. It may make us happy temporarily, but what really makes us happy? And so just even asking that question, what really makes me happy? And then taking action to do that. But also motivating ourselves to reach our goals. I mean, again, it's a really important part of caring for ourselves is setting goals, but then the goals need to be realistic. And again, the goals need to be something that ultimately sustain us and make us happy as opposed to driving us crazy, more, which perfectionists do. And so there's a yin and yang element all the time in everything. There's an accepting, there's a being with, and there's also an acting on. And both are constantly there, and they need to both be constantly there. Because if you don't have any yang energy, your self-acceptance becomes complacency. But if you're all yang and no yin, then your action becomes striving. We have another saying that's just actually a teacher, Rodney Smith, likes to talk about the subtle aggression of self-improvement. This idea that we're always going to get better and better and, transform ourselves. That's an aggressive act, right? It needs to be balanced with self-acceptance. Yeah, I'll try my best. I'll do my best. I'll put energy if it seems like a good, wise use of time. But at the end of the day, my self-worth isn't contingent on achieving those goals or on improving. Right now, I'm in the full mess that I am, the broken human being that I am. I can fully love and accept myself right now in this moment. Nothing else needed.
Wow. Yeah, I think for creative people in particular, they feel so it took me a long time to kind of disconnect my self-worth from the results of my work or, my identity being so tied up in my work, because I realized wow, this is a recipe for disaster. If I base my self-worth on something as, inconsistent as book sales, my self-worth will fluctuate with those book sales.
Exactly. It does. And it does. That's what self-esteem does. And so really self-compassion is an alternative source of self-worth. It doesn't come from judging yourself positively or achieving your goals. Your self-worth simply comes from the fact that you are a conscious human being who suffers and is intrinsically worthy of kindness and compassion. Just like every single baby born on this earth is intrinsically worthy of kindness and compassion, right? And especially from ourselves. Now, other people, I may choose where to invest my compassionate energy to other people, but in terms of myself, I'm not like God, So in terms of the love that opens inward, we can that we don't need to be any different than we are to be fully worthy of our love and kindness and compassion. Now, having said that, see, that's why we also need the yin and yang. We also need both. If we use that as an excuse for complacency and we don't act on, at least try to change the things that we can so that we don't cause so much suffering to ourselves and others, then of course we're going to do that, right? And the self-acceptance, I'm sure you've heard this famous quote from Carl Rogers, the curious paradox is that the more I accept myself, the more I can change. So the two actually work hand in hand. And that's why, again, we know that self-compassion actually encourages self-improvement. It encourages motivation to make changes. It encourages things like repairing past mistakes we've made, even though its foundation is self-acceptance. If you want to take it farther enough, it really points to the illusion of separate self, and it points to the illusion of a separate ego. If you really take this path far enough, and self-compassion is rooted in contemplative practice, it really wakes you up to the realization that the sense of separate self is an illusion created by thought. And self-compassion actually helps us hold that illusion with kindness so that we don't take it so seriously. And then we can operate. It's a completely different perspective than we normally carry around with us in everyday life.
So what impact did being raised by a single mother and having your father leave have on your own self-compassion?
Well, I was lucky. So my mother, I was very securely attached. My mother, was really met my needs. We were very close, and she was very supportive. So I never really had any self-worth issues generally. Now my father leaving led to, some relationship issues, which I talk about in my book, that in the domain of romantic relationships, I think I was less secure. I made a more, poor choices because I was looking to get that sort of validation from a man and that support from a man that I never really received from my father. So, but I think that the fact that my mother was able to give me an overall sense of secure attachment and worth is what allowed me to use self-compassion as a way to deal with my wounds within the more limited sphere of relationships. And I also believe that we have different parts. Not only is the self an illusion, the idea that we are a single self is an illusion. The reality is we have lots of different parts to us that come out in different contexts that, sometimes are diametrically opposed to each other. So we aren't even one particular single way.
Mm-hmm. How has your research, the work that you've done, changed the relationships with people in your life? Because my mom constantly jokes with me that she has to always worry that anything that comes out of her mouth is now potential for a blog post or something that's going to go in a book.
Right. Yeah. So it's true. I do tell a lot of personal stories in my books as well. Some people, I haven't had anyone say anything negative about it, but I'm sure, like I talk about my father in my first book, and I'm sure, he probably wishes things were different, but I think respects my right to write about my own experience. So, for me, the research is actually almost secondary to the practice of self-compassion. It started for me as a practice. It still is primarily a practice. I actually research it primarily because I want to convince other people that this is empirically supported, that it's not just woo-woo talk. And so that hopefully will give them confidence in trying to practice it. But ultimately it's about the practice. And so self-compassion is really it's a way of life. It's not some separate thing. It's just a way of approaching everything in life.
So what that makes me wonder, I've talked to numerous psychologists and therapists here, and I've had friends who are coaches, and we'll sit down and I'll be telling them about something and they will go into coaching mode. And I'm like, just shut up and listen to me. I don't want your advice. And I wonder, do you find it difficult to turn off that sort of lens through which you see the world based on your research when you have normal interactions with people?
Well, because one of the important parts of, so for instance, in the training program we developed, the Mindful Self-Compassion program, we actually teach compassionate listening. And compassionate listening means no advice giving, right? So I really don't like the idea that, if people come to me like just giving advice, I actually don't like to give advice. I don't think it's necessarily compassionate to give advice. I will teach people skills and tools to have self-compassion so they can give themselves their own advice. But I'm not a coach. I don't really play that role, and I'm uncomfortable with that role because, how do I know what you need? You're the only one who knows what you need, but I'll teach you some practices that will help you figure out what you need, but I'm not going to tell you it. So, I don't tend to do that so much with my friends. I mean, occasionally I do, but I've really learned the hard way that my friends, what they really want is just my unconditional support and presence and love. And they can figure it out on their own.
Well, let's talk about emotional resilience. I think that is particularly relevant given what many people are dealing with right now. But before we get into emotional resilience and sort of navigating job markets and all that stuff, there's something you said that really struck me and said, you remember that rumination on negative thoughts and emotions stems from the underlying desire to be safe. Yeah. Even though these brain patterns may be counterproductive, we can still honor them for trying diligently so to keep us out of the jaws of the crocodile. And it made me think of an experience I had of a breakup that just made a mess of my head. It was like the rumination was endless. And it was kind of like every day I would replay every moment and be like, oh, if I changed this, would this have turned out differently? Mm-hmm. And, I literally hashed this out for 6 months in therapy. And I was like, wow, no matter how many times I replay this, the outcome is still the same. Right. How do you break that rumination cycle? And because I remember, I think right after that breakup happened, I drank 3/4 of a bottle of whiskey and smoked 2 packs of cigarettes in a day. And I went to a doctor and she said, you're punishing yourself.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So how do you break that cycle?
Yeah, well, so that's, so one of the most powerful outcomes of self-compassion is less rumination. Because with rumination, again, it's like we're stuck because we can't accept that something that we didn't want to happen happened. And when we do think that, that feels scary, it feels scary not to be in control. And the rumination is like a valiant attempt to give us a sense of control, right? Again, because we want to be safe. It's not because we're bad people. It's just the natural desire to be safe. And so what you can use self-compassion in many ways to break the cycle. Probably the easiest thing to do, or at least one of the first things you can do, is tune into the pain of rumination. It doesn't feel good to ruminate. It doesn't feel good to be stuck on the same thought going around and around in your head. And so you can be kind to yourself because of that pain, right? You can bring in the 3 components of self-compassion. First, you're just mindful of the pain involved in rumination. Remember that, hey, you aren't alone. First of all, this is partly the way the human brain is designed, but you certainly are not the first person to ruminate after a breakup. This is part of the experience. Nothing wrong with you. There's nothing abnormal. This is just, it happens, and then just kind of speaking to yourself like you speak to a good friend, hey, this is so tough. I'm so sorry. How can I help in this moment? I'm here for you. Right. And just making that shift in perspective itself tends to break the rumination. One, because you aren't so lost in the difficult thoughts. When you take the perspective of a friend toward yourself, you automatically jump out of being lost in the thoughts and you're taking an outside perspective. But it's really the warmth that makes the biggest difference. When we can feel the warmth, then we can relax. And part of this is just physiological. Rumination is usually tied to sympathetic nervous system activation, fight or flight, cortisol and adrenaline. Warmth is tied to parasympathetic response. We calm down, our heart rate becomes more variable, release oxytocin and opiates, we feel safer. And so just physiologically, when bringing in the warmth, especially if we add some touch, like a simple gesture of putting your hand on your body in some way that feels comforting and soothing, that alone can break the rumination cycle. It's not rocket science.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think even in rumination, at least in my rumination on breakups and any other traumatic experience, has always been looking for whatever I did that was why is this my fault? I think is the default narrative that goes on in my head. Now, I don't know if that's common to most people in rumination. But what is that tendency? Why do we have that tendency to look for where we're at fault in things that don't turn out the way we want to? Because if you get fired from a job, to some degree, there must be a role that you played in that. I know, because I've been fired from all of my jobs.
Yeah. It's simple. It's a desire for control. If it was your fault, then theoretically it was under your control. And theoretically, if you could have just done things differently, the bad thing wouldn't have happened and you'd be safe, And so it's just the desire for control. And of course we want control. Of course we want to be safe. This is the ego. This is what the ego does. But, the truth is we have very little control. We've got some influence. We can make a difference. There are things we can try to do, but we certainly don't have control. Because the self that thinks it has control is an illusion, right? So we're the combination of our genes, our hormones, what we ate that day, our parenting, our upbringing, our culture, the last thought we just had 10 seconds ago. All these factors are continually arising and changing and in a very complex interaction to create moment to moment what arises in our mind and the decisions we make. There is no separate self that has control. And that scares the ego to death because, the ego is afraid of dying. I mean, if you really take this deep enough, that's what it kind of all boils down to, is the illusion of the separate self, the desire for control, the desire for survival. Freud would probably call it, fear of death. But if you really look at it, that's what's happening. And so the reason self-compassion can break that cycle is, it's like, okay, well, you're a mess and you don't have control, and that's okay. I love you anyway. You aren't really real, and that's okay. Love is here anyway. It doesn't require, there's no set of requirements to have self-compassion. It's just there. You just need to tap into it.
Well, I think that makes a perfect segue to talking about the situation that we're in now, in which I think we're all kind of realizing, wow, we're out of control. And yet, even though we're out of control, people are suffering. We can't argue about the reality of people suffering. Like, I feel like, I'm incredibly privileged. Like, I don't have to go to a job that requires me to be somewhere where I could potentially die or be exposed to this virus. It just, Richard Haas, the economist, wrote a book called World in Disarray. And now it seems like that is very much the case. So how do you deal, what role do you think self-compassion can play in getting us out of this mess?
Well, the first role it has is in accepting that we are in this mess, right? So if we spend all our time figuring out how do I get out of this, and we don't open to the pain that is here right now, then that pain's not going away. And in fact, we're resisting it, and it'll probably just get worse, right? And so self-compassion, the first step is opening to, wow, this is really hard. I feel lonely. I feel terrified. I feel grief. I feel overwhelmed. And, all those painful emotions we can turn toward, right? And especially with the yin self-compassion, we can hold it with loving, connected presence. We can hold our pain. The heart is infinitely large. The heart can hold any amount of pain because there's no limit to how big our heart is, right? The limit is just a thought, but actually love can hold anything. And so we can hold our pain with love and connection and presence and be there for ourselves. And then we can start to calm down a little bit. And then we can ask ourselves, well, what can I do? There may not be a lot we can do. We can try our best to do whatever we can to meet our needs, but we won't be able to control it. And the reality is that we're all going to, at some point, we're all going to die. I mean, it's not to be negative, but I mean, this is the reality of human life. And we don't even want to open to that reality. It's like we want to somehow have this permanent existence. And that's not the way things work. We have very limited control. We try our best to, make the best decisions we can, to be as healthy as we can. We try to alleviate our suffering. And at the end of the day, probably our best option is to turn toward what is with great love and kindness and acceptance. And we actually learn to rest our awareness. And it's kind of, I know it's a vague term, but you learn to identify not so much with the contents of your experience, whether they're painful or frightening or sad or whatever it is. You learn to start to identify with the loving, connected presence that's holding your experience. And that becomes more salient to you. And loving, connected presence is a positive emotion. It feels good. It feels safe. It feels connected. And so you're moving from what's happening, your focus to be on what's happening. How can I control what's happening? How can I make things different than they are? You're moving your focus to how am I relating to what's happening? And then that's a place where we have a lot more room to play. And it's a lot more effective also.
So that, raises sort of two final questions. So as you were saying that, I was thinking about the fact that, somebody who why grief is so relative. So for example, I respond to a breakup like a parent died, and a person who has a parent die doesn't respond nearly as horribly as I did to a breakup.
Right.
Why is that? And can we actually mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a ton of reasons why that is, right? In terms of what's most important to you, how it relates to your sense of self, how much health threatening is the event. All these things are going to differ between individuals and between situations. And so, in terms of mitigating that, you can't change your genes or your personality, or your family history, right? So probably the reason, I don't know your history, but I'm sure there's a lot of reasons in your personal history that lead to you taking breakups in a particularly hard way. There's no need to change that. There's no need to fix yourself, but if you relate to that pattern with kindness, with acceptance, with this kind of helpful attitude of, okay, well, I'm here for you. How can I support you through this? Then, in a way, it doesn't even matter so much if you take it hard or not. You probably aren't going to change that personality. You might make a little dent, but as long as so for instance, for myself, after 20 years of self-compassion practice, I still basically have the same personality. I tend to get very reactive. I kind of biologically, my nervous system is wired to be reactive, despite how much mindfulness and meditation and self-compassion practice I do. And, really, although I try as much as I can to be present and not react, it still happens, not as much as it used to, but it still happens more than I would like. And that's okay. Because what happens is it arises, and almost immediately I'm aware of it, and I can apologize and I can work with it. And, it's not debilitating, but it's still there. I didn't choose to have that pattern. If I did, I wouldn't have it. Right. And so I think we can just kind of work with what is in the way that's most effective and most loving and most connected. And that's really, enough. And you might say, well, that's not good enough. Okay, you can say that, but how's that going to help you? If what you're really saying is, but no, it's really, really, really important to me to try to change this personality trait. Okay, great. Then try as much as you can. If you really think that there is some movement to be had, you can try to make the change, give yourself support and encouragement. But again, the bottom line always needs to be that you're still a worthy human being exactly as you are, to be that compassionate mess. And really, once you change your goal to being a compassionate mess, everything changes. The whole structure of it changes. And people are afraid if my goal is to become a compassionate mess, then I'll be more of a mess than I am now. It's actually it's the exact opposite. The more you can be compassionate with the mess you are, actually the easier it becomes to make changes, because we aren't fighting things. We aren't resisting things. We feel safer. We feel calmer as we make those changes. We're more supported. I mean, I'm sorry, but shame and self-criticism are lousy foundations on which to make change. They kind of work, but they have so many unintended consequences, like anxiety and fear of failure, and just kind of depressing you, that it's not working very well. So.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it just kind of reminds me, anytime I talk to people in your position, I ask them, like psychologists in particular, are you immune to all the things that you help other people with? And no, absolutely not.
No, that's why I'm glad I'm a self-compassion teacher, not a mindfulness teacher, because my mindfulness is kind of spotty. I can be mindful and I meditate, but in the moment, because of my reactive personality, the mindfulness goes out the window. But it does come up very quickly afterward, and the way I relate to it, again, that's the thing. It's still there, but it's not debilitating. It's okay. I can work with it. Everything becomes workable with self-compassion and mindfulness. But I'm still a mess, and that's okay, because everyone's okay. I'm perfectly imperfect, Yeah.
I love that. Well, I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up our conversation. So I have one final question for you, which is how we finish all of our interviews. They had Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Unmistakable. Do you mind if you define what you mean by what you mean unmistakable?
Yeah. So when you write a book, you have to define it. I define it as something so distinctive that nobody else could have done it but you, that it's immediately recognized as your work or an expression of who you are.
Right, so interesting. So what is it that makes someone or someone's work unmistakable? Well, I mean, I think you've probably gotten this answer before. It just has to boil down to authenticity, right? So each individual is unique. Each individual has a particular set of, their history and their influences and genetics and socialization and culture and all those things. And I think when people are fully, completely authentic, and by the way, self-compassion is strongly linked to authenticity. It really helps you to be who you really are. When you express yourself in a completely authentic way, then I think it's unmistakably yours. I think when you try to create something that's going to please other people, or that's based on what you think is good, based on what other people have done, then it might end up being more derivative.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and share your wisdom and your story with our listeners. This is, I'm sure, going to help a lot of people. Where can people find out more about you, your work, your books, and everything else that you're up to?
Yeah, well, the easiest way to find me is just to Google self-compassion, the word. You'll come to my website, and I've got, if you're a science nerd, I've got, hundreds and hundreds of research articles organized by category. You can test your own self-compassion level. I've guided meditations. I have exercises. I have, links to how to get self-compassion training. And there's just a lot of free information there, and it's a good place to start.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.